Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS legal hotline lawyer. And today I am once again joined by
Ken Sachs, designated broker, Spokane, Washington.
What's your company?
Keller Williams, Spokane. And we have about 6 branches and all kinds of stuff. So
Great. Thank you. So we left off in this video series talking about the initial inspection period in Form 35. So let's pick up with the inspection has been done, and maybe buyer also had electrician or plumber in there. Okay, we've got the initial inspection done, and the inspector said, buyer, you might have a problem with the HVAC. Okay. Made notes in the inspection report about problems with the HVAC, but that's it. That's all they said about the HVAC. Buyer says, ooh, I want somebody else to look at the HVAC. What do we do now?
So did the inspector not recommend an additional inspection?
Just said, here's some problems with the HVAC.
So how about if the inspector, we ask him, could you put in the inspection report that you recommend an additional inspection on the HVAC?
Why is that important?
Because if we want to do an additional inspection on the HVAC, and in this scenario, we want to do an additional inspection on the HVAC, the 35R says that we must attach the inspector's recommendation if we are going to exercise our ability to do that secondary inspection. So I need his or her recommendation.
Okay, so technical issues really fast. Our initial inspection period was by default 10 days.
Okay.
And our additional inspection period is by default 5 days. And one thing I want to make sure that brokers understand is that buyers have a contractual right to those additional inspection period, to that additional inspection period, to those 5 days, right? Yep. This is not a request that buyer's making of seller, may I have permission to do additional inspections. Buyer has already negotiated for the right to claim that additional inspection period by having the Form 35 in the purchase and sale agreement, right?
Seller already agreed to it.
Seller already agreed to it. All that's necessary in order for buyer to claim those 5 days is for buyer to deliver a Form 35R with the appropriate box marked on the first section, and to attach, as you already said, inspector's recommendation. Now here's where I'm getting a lot of questions. Hopefully everybody knows, we haven't covered this yet on the video series, we're going to get to that in a minute, but as of July 1st, 2019, no buyer may provide seller with a copy of the buyer's inspection report or any of the pages of the inspection report. Yay.
Yes.
So what does that look like if Form 35 is saying you can't give me a copy of the inspection report, but you got to give me the inspector's recommendation for additional inspections? What does that mean?
To just provide the recommendation that the inspector gave you.
So in the real world, how do you do that? Do you take the page where the recommendation is and black out all the information above and below that?
I've done that.
Okay.
I just want to show the recommendation. I don't want to provide any other information.
Okay.
Because we're not supposed to. You don't want to do that.
Okay.
Just provide the recommendation.
Okay. Perfect. So we're going to have an HVAC additional inspection, right?
Yep.
But in our case, the buyer says, but you know what? I'm uncomfortable that the inspector didn't tell me that there's definitely something wrong with that bathroom floor, but said that there could be, and I think I want to have a contractor look at that also. So since I'm going to have the additional inspection period anyhow, can I just have a contractor come in and look at the bathroom floor also?
But we don't have any recommendation from the inspector to do that.
So what should we do?
And the 35R says we must attach that recommendation in order to do that secondary inspection. We don't have that recommendation. So we want that recommendation.
So is it okay to go back to the inspector and say, hey, can you supplement your inspection report one more time? I need a recommendation to have a specialist look at the potential dry rot in the bathroom floor?
And the inspector didn't say anything about it initially?
No. The inspector said, not sure what's going on here with this floor.
Oh, the inspector would be willing to do that.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, perfect. So it's okay. Even if the inspector doesn't on their own write in recommendations, you think it's okay for the buyer broker to suggest that the inspector might want to add additional recommendations to the inspector's report so that the buyer can use that to bring another specialist into the property.
The inspector already implied that there was an issue, and so I'm not asking you to do anything that you never even touched on.
Right.
I'm just asking you finish that thought, because I need that in order to come in and do a secondary inspection.
Right. I agree 100% that buyer brokers can do that. Whew. And I get this question from time to time, and I'll say that the form creates a pretty clear implication, but the words themselves are fairly ambiguous. The form doesn't specifically say that you would necessarily have to have a recommendation for each individual issue that the buyer wants to have separately investigated in that additional inspection period, but the implication is there. And so the safest approach, buyer brokers, is to simply ask the inspector, you've already noted this item, buyer wants to have an additional inspection of this issue. Would you please supplement your report to include an additional inspection recommendation for this particular topic if they didn't already do that? And maybe we're going to have inspectors start doing that more and more often anyway. It's to their advantage.
Well, in the inspector world, why wouldn't they want to do that? It's just more layers of covering themselves.
That's exactly right. Okay, so we trigger our additional inspection period. And what is, in your opinion, the most significant thing about the difference between the initial inspection period and the additional inspection period?
The biggest difference between the two periods, besides the time, is now we are not bringing in kind of a person that wears multiple hats. We're bringing in somebody who primarily focuses on whatever it is we want them to have a secondary inspection on. The HVAC, the roof, the electrical panel. So
Okay.
This is not an inspector, this is an electrician.
Or a roofer.
Or a roofer.
Or an HVAC guy.
Yes.
And one of the biggest distinctions, in my opinion, is that while the buyer was required to conform to the home inspector statute during the initial inspection period, that requirement is gone in the additional inspection period. And the language of the additional inspections provision says buyer can bring a specialist into seller's property to look at that item. So a specialist may be a contractor, because remember in the initial inspection period, we talked about one of the exemptions that's not there for the statute is a licensed contractor.
Right, buyer or home inspector.
Right. Or electrician, plumber, that kind of thing,
Yeah.
but not a contractor. So now in the additional inspection period, buyer wants to have a roofing contractor, a contractor look at that dry rot floor in the bathroom, an HVAC contractor, whatever it is. A specialist could include a contractor, and so buyer can bring a contractor into seller's home without additional permission from the seller during the additional inspections provision, right?
Because seller already agreed to it in Form 35.
Right. Okay. Perfect. Anything else we want to talk about right this second with respect to additional inspections?
There's so many things in my head, and I don't know what's appropriate or not, but this is not where buyer broker, don't ask for anything yet if you're doing that secondary inspection. If repair items came up from your initial inspection, save them, put them in your back pocket, then do the secondary inspection, then ask for everything at once.
That's right. I agree.
You see a lot of buyer brokers, they'll ask for something, then do a secondary. Well, Annie, I'll ask you a question. What if I'm the seller and I sign off and say, okay, we'll do those 5 things?
Then the inspection contingency is satisfied without buyer getting their additional inspections done. You are 100% correct. If buyer is going to do additional inspections, then buyer broker, do not ask for any repairs or concessions from seller prior to the completion of those
Right.
additional inspections, and then timely submission of the entire repair request or concession request,
All
right?
at once.
All at
Yep.
once, right? And so I've heard some brokers say that if you haven't asked for it before additional inspections, then all you're allowed to ask for after additional inspections is what was inspected as by the additional inspection contractor, right? Wrong.
There's a lot of creative interpretations out there.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we got our additional inspections done, and buyer is ready to ask for concessions.
Okay.
All right. So my question is, how should buyer broker draft that Form 35R to request concessions? I'm going to take the first shot.
Okay.
I'm going to say that since buyer has gone through their additional inspection period and they've had contractors come in and evaluate the HVAC system and that floor in the bathroom and the roof or whatever else there is, buyer now should have some bids for work to be done. And let's say that after our buyer's done all of this, the price tag at the bottom of all 3 of those bids put together is $7,500. I'm going to suggest that the most efficient way to negotiate the Form 35R is to ask seller for a price concession. We've got $7,500 worth of bills. I want a $7,500 price drop, right?
Okay, I follow that.
All right. But if buyer's getting financing, that $7,500 isn't really going to make an impact on buyer's ability after closing to be able to make those repairs, right?
Right.
Okay. So then, my second suggestion would be, to the extent you can make a meaningful, let me back up. To the extent seller can make a meaningful contribution to buyer's closing costs in the amount of those repairs, that's another good way to negotiate it.
Okay.
Because with seller paying buyer's closing costs in an offsetting amount, $7,500 is probably too much in most cases. Let's say it was $3,500. If seller could pay $3,500 of buyer's closing costs, that would put that $3,500 back in buyer's pocket.
Sure.
Buyer could then make the repairs or not after closing if they wanted to.
Right.
And so if we were going to do that, all that buyer broker would write would take their Form 35R, mark the box for seller shall, and then write on there which box is it on the form when you're asking seller to make concessions?
It's the fourth box.
Where you're asking seller to make concessions?
On the first section of 35R, it's the fourth box.
Okay. So you mark that fourth box and then write on those blank lines, purchase price shall be whatever the purchase price was less $7,500.
Right.
Or seller shall pay $3,500 of buyer's closing costs at closing, right?
Yes. What I like about that is short and sweet and to the point. Because I read some of these 35Rs and they're like going on with these stories about this is why and because and we think and maybe this. We're not trying to impress anybody with our creative writing abilities. Be short and to the point. Drop the price. The price is now this. Period.
So let's say we did that. Let's say we use the closing cost concession and seller agrees to pay $3,500 we ask seller to agree to pay $3,500. Is there a reason to then write on those blank lines because the HVAC system needs or because the roof needs? Is there any reason to write that?
To me, it's irrelevant. Just put down, we want this to happen to the price. This much of a reduction.
That's right. I agree with you.
It's irrelevant.
And it's even worse. It's even worse than irrelevant because lender's going to come along, not lender, mortgage broker is going to come along or bank rep is going to come along and say, we don't want that language in there, so eliminate the Form 35R, which then puts broker in a position of mortgage fraud. But there was no requirement to write that language in the first place, so you avoid that issue with the mortgage broker by never writing it in the first place. So be short and sweet on your Form 35R. Reduce the purchase price, have seller pay closing costs, or whatever.
Right. Okay. Or even worse, when there's not enough room on that 35R to go on about irrelevant things, they now grab a Form 34 because they need more space. Right. And they continue going on about, here's why. Who cares? I want the price reduced. Ask for it, period.
Perfect. Okay, so then let's pretend that, because this isn't pretending for most transactions, in most transactions, a price concession or closing cost concession isn't going to work for some reason or another. Maybe the work needs to be done before closing, for example. What is your recommendation for brokers drafting that Form 35R competently?
Well, in your scenario, you already implied that we have bids. We have a bid of $7,500, I think you said. So if we have a bid and that's what we want to have done, why wouldn't we just attach that bid to the 35R and say, seller, do this.
Okay.
Do this.
And I would use language something along the lines of seller shall hire, and then I'd name the contractor that's identified on the bid, ABC contractor, to perform all of the work identified on the attached bid, right?
Yeah, and that way buyer knows exactly what you're asking seller to do.
And whose contractor identified the work that needs to be done?
The contractor that the buyer used.
Is that important?
For a house that the buyer's buying? Yes.
Okay, so then here we go. You ready?
I don't know.
Is that different? I agree with you, that's right. But is that different than the way the industry typically handles this issue today?
It's very different. And the way it's handled today and the popular way is seller, we will let you hire anybody you want, and whatever they say needs to be done, we're good with it.
And yep, I agree with you. And in fairness, buyer broker usually writes on there that the seller has to hire a licensed and bonded contractor to, but I still say, big whoop, that doesn't make any difference. Seller can hire a licensed bonded. So let's back up for a second. Here's where we are. Buyer's inspector, who buyer trusts because they've now, had this day spent with their inspector, and they paid the inspector and they trust the inspector, and the inspector said, wow, this electrical panel is shot. It's dangerous. It's, whatever they want to tell you about it. And so that's in the buyer's mind. And so buyer broker writes, seller shall hire a licensed and bonded electrician to determine whether the electrical panel is faulty and make repairs as necessary.
Yeah, fix whatever.
Have you ever seen language like that?
All the time.
All the time. And then maybe the buyer's broker even attaches the inspector's report, right?
Yes.
So time out right here.
Yes.
Can that happen anymore?
No, not without permission.
As of July 1st, 2019, no buyer inspector report or pages of the report get attached to the Form 35R or delivered to seller in any fashion, seller or listing broker in any fashion, right?
Right.
So that's our background material. Okay. So when buyer's broker drafts the language regarding this presumably faulty electrical panel, putting the burden on seller to hire an electrician to check it out, is there an emotional difference for the buyer between these two things? Seller hires an electrician, licensed electrician, who looks at the panel and says, there's nothing wrong with this panel. Yep, it's old. Maybe it's even a Federal Pacific, but there's nothing wrong with this panel.
Yeah, or the breaker was loose. I tightened it. It's good now.
It's good now. Is there an emotional impact that's different to the buyer if the seller's electrician says that versus if the buyer has an electrician go out and look at it and go, there's nothing wrong with this panel. I understand why your inspector was alerted, but there's nothing wrong with this panel and you don't need to make any replacements.
It's all emotions. This is such an emotional business, and it's a trust thing. Like you said, buyer and buyer's inspector have already started kind of forming that trust-based relationship.
Right.
And so it's just that comfort level. It's already emotional enough buying a house. And so to add that other element that doesn't need to be there, where somebody who's seller aligned with to tell you, it's fine.
Right.
Okay. I mean, that's not comfortable.
That's right. I agree with you 100%. So buyer brokers, it's your buyer's inspection contingency.
Yes.
Your buyer has the right to do these inspections. Do not, as the buyer's representative, give the buyer's right to inspect back to the seller and say to the seller, hey, we don't really want to take the time or energy or even spend the money. So that's another thing. What if the buyer has to pay a $100 trip charge to a contractor to go out and evaluate an issue in the new home that buyer's purchasing? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, so what? Pay it. You're buying a house, for crying out loud. And we're talking about, we talked about HVAC, a system that, $3,000-$4,000 on up. If it's $100 to find out exactly what's wrong with it, if it's going to function properly, if it's not going to function properly, $100 when you're in the process of buying a house, if you really get upset with that, should you be buying a house? There's going to be things that come up.
Right. Now, I know brokers are going to hear this and they're going to push back and say, buyers don't want to pay that. Okay, I would agree with you. Buyers probably would also rather not pay the full price of the purchase price, right? I'd rather pay half of the purchase price. But buyers can't pay half the purchase price. They have to pay the full purchase price, and nobody's surprised by that because that's the way it's always been. Now, what's different about this issue is that as an industry, we've never really expected buyers to pay contractors to go out and give us bids for the work that's going to need to be done on the house that they're going to own. And so industry members, it's going to be up to you to help buyer understand that this is not a crazy thing.
Right.
It's your inspection period. It's you who's going to be owning the house. It's you who has a vested interest in knowing whether or not there really is something wrong with this $4,000 HVAC system. Because if there is, let's get it repaired now before closing on the seller's dime, rather than making that discovery later because you didn't want to spend $100
it's
having
cheap insurance.
Right.
Yep.
All right. But it is a shift in the way our industry thinks.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So then, back to what you were going to tell us.
Okay.
If we don't want to use the price concession or the closing cost
Okay.
concession, we're negotiating the Form 35R. Buyer broker is drafting it. We've got some bids from contractors. How do you draft that? Oh, maybe we already covered this.
We did say that. I would attach it, and then you provided the language.
Okay.
And that's what we would submit.
Okay, perfect. Now, if seller's response is, no way on God's green earth am I hiring ABC contractor. I don't know that, I don't like them. I don't trust them. I like XYZ contractor.
So that's the seller's response.
That's the seller's response.
Okay, so now ball is back in buyer's court.
But what? No, I'm sorry. What do you as the listing broker do with that from seller? Let's talk about that first.
Buyer broker or listing broker?
You're the listing broker now.
Okay.
What do you say to that seller when that's the seller's reaction?
Why? Where's this coming from? I'd kind of like to know why the seller is firmly against hiring that company. I would be hesitant to also allow the seller to dictate who's going to come in and do the inspection or the work on the HVAC. I would be hesitant to do that because I don't want the seller. I always tell sellers, I don't want you to get that call 6 months after closing and it's from a lawyer or something. Something really bad happened. So to me, that there's just needless exposure to have the seller determine who's going to do it.
Okay.
You know, and if you really fight about it, if seller really stomps his feet and holds his breath, I think that could come back and bite him if something does go wrong. Because why were you so in favor of
There you
having
go.
your guy come in?
I like that.
I mean, that started to smell like collusion, maybe.
Okay, so maybe what the seller says is this is too high of a price. This shouldn't cost this. Any problem with saying to the seller, then let's go get your own bid. Call your own contractor, get your own bid. Maybe you have to pay them $100 for a trip charge. Get your own bid, and let's see how the price comparison is.
That's
Right.
I like it.
Okay,
There's nothing wrong
and
with that.
if there's a similarity in pricing, your recommendation is go with the buyer's choice,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Because then it's not seller, you're out
Create
of the
that
equation,
separation.
right? If there's a huge price disparity, then maybe we're gonna have to
Yeah,
figure that
something's
out.
going on here. We need to look at it more.
Okay, all right. Okay, so once again, we are not anywhere close to being finished with this discussion, but we've really got to stop this video at some point.
Okay.
So let's call it quits for
Okay.
today. And then when we come back, we're going to talk about negotiating.
All right.
Until then, if you have any questions, send them to me, legal hotline at warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.